Hello, this video is on languages in the New Testament. Let me share my screen. Okay, the picture there you can see is of Codex Vaticanus, one of the first full texts of the New Testament, written in Greek. Now, this video isn't really going to be an exhaustive examination of the subject of languages in the New Testament, not exhaustive at all. It just has a few points that I thought were interesting and that I wanted to make in a video. The New Testament is written in Greek. So Greek is the Greek culture was a completely pagan culture. And so what would be a good word for God in Greek? I mean, if you were a new Christian and you needed to write something in Greek or even speak the language, what word would you use for God? The statue there is Zeus. But you wouldn't want to use Zeus, Zeus being the supreme god of the pantheon of Greek gods, but that would be kind of a contaminated word. You wouldn't want to use that. And would a pagan culture like the Greek culture, with no history of monotheism, even have a good word for God? Well, it turns out that they did have a good word for God, theos. It was used by some of the earlier philosophers, and it was a word that could be used for God, and that's the word which gets used in the New Testament. And interestingly, most pagan cultures do have an acceptable and not tarnished word for God. So let's talk about Greek a little bit. The language of the Roman world at the time of the New Testament was Greek. Throughout the Roman world, pretty much everybody could speak some Greek. That's an unusual thing in history, but it was true at the time of the New Testament. And the earliest New Testament manuscripts that we have are all in Greek. The New Testament Greek is called Koine, which just means common Greek, to distinguish it from other types of Greek. There's nothing special about Koine Greek. It's the regular language spoken by people commonly at that time. We usually distinguish it from other types of Greek, like classical Greek would have been earlier, before the time of Christ, used by philosophers like Plato and Socrates and by some other earlier Greek literature. And then, today we have modern Greek, but modern Greek has changed substantially from the time of the Bible. Just wanted to say a few things about Greek styles. In the New Testament, we have got about 9 different authors, maybe plus or minus 1, but about 9 different authors. And they also have the different authors sometimes used an amanuensis. I don't even know how to pronounce that, but this is the plural of an amanuensis. That would be somebody who's doing the writing for them. In other words, maybe the person we call the author is really speaking while the person with the pen in the hand, that's the amanuensis. And Paul in particular would use somebody like that for almost everything that he wrote. And these different authors, these 9 different New Testament authors, may have been quoting other people too. And sometimes, even though you have the same author, you have got different types of literature. For example, John, I believe, was the author of the Gospel of John, 3 letters, and the book of Revelation. But those are all really different types of literature. And of course, the letters are all very short. Paul writes letters to churches, but he also writes other letters to individuals. And you shouldn't expect that the style that he uses in the letters to the church would necessarily be the same that he used in a letter to an individual. Likewise, you wouldn't expect John writing different types of literature to necessarily use the same type of writing style for the different things that he wrote. And so that's why sometimes you might read that we know that somebody didn't write this or he did write this based on their writing style. And there's something to be said for looking at the style of a writer, but I don't think we can definitively say things about authorship based on the writing style. There's too many different balls in the air with with different amanuenses, different types of literature, different audiences, that sort of thing. Often people like to take the Greek that's in the New Testament and divide it up into three categories. You can really probably do more categories than that, but three are common. Semitic, conversational, and literary. Semitic, these are examples. The Gospel of Mark is in kind of a Semitic style. It reads a little bit like a Hebrew or maybe sometimes maybe in an Aramaic document, but it's in Greek. It just looks like the person who wrote it was writing in the same sort of style that Hebrew was written in. Now, maybe there can be multiple reasons why that would be. You know, the authors of the New Testament, with the exception of Luke, they were all Jews. And so, you know, for them, Greek wouldn't necessarily have been the first language, though for some of them were clearly fluent in it. But so some of the books have a Semitic style. Now, some books have a conversational style, particularly Paul. By conversational, we mean that Paul seems to be talking, and the person writing is writing what Paul is talking about. And the result is the sentences that Paul uses are often kind of long and going on. They're the type of style that people use when a person is talking, and it's a little bit different from the style that we would normally use when we're writing. And then the book of Hebrews, and maybe a few other books show a little bit of this too, but it's kind of in a high literary style. And the name might throw you. You might think that Hebrews would be something in a Semitic style, but it is not. It is kind of a high literary form. You can place other books of the New Testament in these same categories, but people tend to argue about them a little bit. Some of them are a little bit split, where, you know, parts of Luke are kind of Semitic, but other parts not so much. So anyway, those are three common styles you have in the New Testament. Like I said, other books can be placed in the table above, but there's usually some dispute about how to do it. Greek grammar rules. Greek grammar rules are kind of an interesting subject because you can go to the internet and buy yourself a biblical Greek grammar book. And people who learn it do that, and that's very valuable. But it's probably worth reminding people that we don't actually have a contemporary Koine Greek grammar textbook, if they even ever did have a thing like that, or anything like an MLA style guide. So the grammar rules that we make up, we're really making up the grammar rules based on what kind of Greek we have and what we read and how it seems to work. And so, but that can be a little bit misleading. This is a little bit of a offbeat subject, but I wanted to bring it up because sometimes you have something like this. This is a passage from Revelation 1:4-5. And I have heard it said, for example, in Revelation, that the grammar in Revelation is a little different. And it is. I've heard other people say it has grammar errors, but I don't think you can say that. I give as an example here the words which I've highlighted. This is John 4. It says, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before his throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings on the earth. Okay, so there's a rule in Greek, a grammar rule that we've perceived it maybe to be a rule, that if you have a preposition like the one that's translated from, the words which follow, the nouns which follow, have to be in what's called the genitive form. And the latter part of this follows that rule. From the 7 spirits is genitive. And from Jesus Christ in this case is in the genitive form. But when it says from him who is and who was and who is to come, those are 3 nominative noun forms all in a row. So some people have said, well, it's just a different kind of grammar, and I do think it just, what it indicates is that we don't actually even understand all the grammar. This is the very beginning greeting that John gives at the beginning of the book. He's not going to make 3 grammar errors in a row right at the beginning of the book. It's just an indication that we don't really understand all there is to know about biblical Greek grammar. We're still learning. Now, Greek in other languages is one of the most interesting subjects, I think, about the languages of the New Testament, because everything we have is in Greek. And if you look at the letters, all the letters that are in the New Testament, there's nothing in there that shows any evidence of being translated. It was all original Greek. And that's exactly what you expect. You know, if Paul is writing a letter to a church in Asia Minor, most of the people are Gentiles, they're speaking Greek, so of course he would write it in Greek. Those letters are written to combine Jewish Gentile communities. Greek is the common language, so that's what will be used. Unless you're quoting from the Old Testament. The Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew, so at some point along the line, that would have to have been translated from Hebrew. Now, the Gospels are a little bit different. The Gospels, we have Gospels all in Greek, and maybe early Acts and Revelations seem to be a little bit different too, because the thing is, Jesus and his disciples would not usually be speaking Greek. That wouldn't normally be the thing that people in the land of Judea or Galilee would be speaking if they were Jewish. I believe that Jesus and his disciples all knew Greek, but I don't think that would be their first choice of a language. Most people will agree with me on this. Most scholars will agree that Jesus and his disciples wouldn't usually be speaking Greek. The early church fathers said that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. Most modern scholars do not think that the early church fathers were right about that, but it's a data point that they said that Matthew was originally in Hebrew. Here's an example of a passage which simply had to be spoken in Aramaic. This is Jesus speaking to the Syrophoenician woman, Mark 7:26-30. Now, the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Now, this was a woman not Jewish, so she wouldn't be speaking Hebrew. She was in the Syria Phoenician area where Aramaic was the first language. She was not necessarily a high government official, and so you wouldn't think she'd be using Greek. Almost surely this conversation had to be in Aramaic. And in fact, in the Gospel of Mark especially, there are a number of places where an Aramaic phrase is left in the Gospel. And Mark always makes a point when there's an Aramaic phrase to translate it. And I've got 6 of them in this presentation. The first one in Mark 4:11, Talitha Kumi. And Mark translates it. It means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." Mark 14:36, Abba, Father. Now, we kind of got used to saying Abba, Father, I think, in the Christian church, but really that's a translation. Abba means father. Of course, Abba could be father in Hebrew too, but in general, Mark is using Aramaic, I think, when he does these translations. Mark 15, Jesus says on the cross, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's Aramaic. Ephatha, be opened. Golgotha, which means place of the skull. That's Aramaic. And James and John are called Boanerges, which is sons of thunder. But then there's some places in the gospel when they were clearly originally using Hebrew. An example is in Luke 4. Jesus goes up to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up. As was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, this is a scroll of Isaiah in a synagogue. And in a synagogue, the scrolls of the law and the prophets are Hebrew scrolls. So Jesus is reading here. He's reading something in Hebrew. And yet, Greek, although the disciples may have known Aramaic and Hebrew, there are some words which, even though I believe that they were speaking to each other in one of those Semitic languages, there's some cases where I think that they went ahead and used a Greek word. Like a good classic example would be the Greek word hypocrite. Hypocrite was a word for an actor, and an actor at that day and age at one of the theaters would put on a mask. And so the Greek word hypocrite indicates someone who puts on a mask. And they had theaters in the land of Galilee where they grew up. And so Jesus could say hypocrite and everybody would know what it meant. It doesn't mean that Jesus was speaking Greek. It just means that it was a Greek word which had come into the language. Sort of like if I mentioned a pizza that I had for dinner, it doesn't mean that I'm speaking Italian. It's just an Italian word that has come into our language. Now, it's almost an axiom that when someone does a video like this, he's going to tell you what all the answers are. But I'm going to change that a little bit here and leave you with a question. And I honestly don't know the answer to this question. It's just something to think about. Look at this verse, or almost any verse, almost everything that Jesus says. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And my question is, what language was Jesus speaking when he said this? And I don't know what the answer is. I think that the common answer that will be given is that it was Aramaic. And the reason is that in the Christian community, a little over 100 years ago, the idea developed that Hebrew had become a dead language by the time of the New Testament. Let me read this statement by Bruce Metzger, a very prominent and considerable New Testament scholar. He said, for the ordinary Jewish populace, Hebrew was approaching the status of a dead language. So the thinking is that they were speaking Aramaic. Some years back, Mel Gibson did a movie, The Passion of the Christ, which was a lot of people watched it. And in that, they did all the speaking in Aramaic, except for when Jesus went and spoke to Pontius Pilate, he switched to Latin. But all the other speaking in there was Aramaic. So this is the view that has developed in the Christian community, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, liberal or conservative. Everybody has kind of developed the idea that Hebrew was a dead language, and that they would be speaking Aramaic. But here's the wrinkle on that, and that is that the Jewish people, who are the ones who would actually be doing the speaking, don't have that view. I mean, that's an idea that grew up in the Christian church. Let me read to you this exchange which took place between, this is a picture of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was prime minister at the time of this story, and Pope Francis, when Pope Francis visited Israel. Netanyahu is speaking. He says, Jesus was here in this land. He spoke Hebrew. Netanyahu told Francis at a public meeting in Jerusalem, in which the Israeli leader cited a strong connection between Judaism and Christianity. Aramaic, the Pope interjected. He spoke Aramaic, but he knew Hebrew, Netanyahu shot back. And the two leaders then, they have a lot to talk about. They moved on to other things. But the point is, maybe if they had gone on a little farther, they could have clarified the extent to which they either agreed or disagreed. But the point is, this is just only an example of the fact that actually the Jewish people don't accept this particular idea that they didn't speak Hebrew at the time of the New Testament. They say that they continued speaking Hebrew all the way up until the end of the Great Rebellion, when most of the Jews were dispersed in the world. And this view that they didn't speak Hebrew has affected a little bit of our scholarship, maybe in some ways which I don't really like. For example, there's a Greek word Hebraisti, and this is how it's translated. I've got it in red. This is John 19:20, talking about the sign above Jesus's cross. The title then was read by many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. So the King James Version, this is the King James Version, and some other versions, including some which are fairly modern, but they translate Hebraisti as Hebrew. On the other hand, some other contemporary translations, like the English Standard Version and the NIV, translate Hebraisti as Aramaic. And there are other translations, like the New American Standard, which translate it as Hebrew, but then give a footnote saying, but it means Aramaic. I think that's a mistake. You can judge for yourself, but I would think Hebraisti, you ought to translate it as Hebrew. And that shows up several places in the New Testament. When they wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are close to being contemporary with the New Testament, here's a list of statistics about what language the scrolls were written in. Most of them were Hebrew. A lot of them were Aramaic, and some of them were Greek. And really, I think that to me kind of tells the story, is that the people at that location at that time were able to speak Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, all three. And finally, one quote from the Mishnah. You probably don't hear many quotes from the Mishnah from a Christian, but here's one because it's kind of telling. The Mishnah was part of the Talmud. It was written a couple hundred years, not very long after Christ. And the Mishnah is written mostly in Hebrew, but very heavy Aramaic influence. It says, "You shall live in my house and shall be maintained from my estate all the days you are a widow in my house." And that is written in Aramaic in the Mishnah. Thus the people of Jerusalem would write. The people of Galilee would write as the people of Jerusalem. The people of Judea would write, "Until the heirs agree to give you your ketubah." And that particular sentence in quotes was written in Hebrew. And the point of the thing is, what the Jews believe about this is at this time that the people in Jerusalem and the Galilee would often speak Aramaic, but the people in Judea, maybe outside of Jerusalem, would speak Hebrew. So to go back to my original question about when Jesus is speaking to his disciples, there's just such things as "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What language was he speaking in? And the answer is, I really don't know. If you check any other modern Christian scholar, whether it's liberal or conservative, I think they'll tell you that it's Aramaic. And maybe they're right, but I'm not convinced. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. One more subject. Quoting the Old Testament. Knowing Hebrew, Jesus and the disciples would quote from the Hebrew Old Testament. The Hebrew Old Testament has the law, the prophets, and the writings. It is the same thing that we have in a Protestant Bible Old Testament today, although the books are not in the same order. And so this would be what Jesus and his disciples would use. Knowing Greek, the early church would use the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Septuagint contains the law, the prophets, the writings, and the apocryphal books. The apocryphal books are what you'll find in a Catholic Old Testament. The earlier church fathers, being mostly Gentiles, Greek readers and writers, they often quoted the Apocrypha. The New Testament itself, being written almost entirely by Jews, it never quotes from the Apocrypha. There's a time or two that it references something that happened in there, but it never makes a quote from the Apocrypha. So when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it is actually usually quoting the Septuagint, if there's any difference between the Hebrew Masoretic text and the Septuagint. The Masoretic text is the name of the primary Hebrew Old Testament text, which is preserved today. If you've got an Old Testament, it was translated mostly from the Hebrew Masoretic text. But when the New Testament is quoting the Old Testament, it's usually quoting the Septuagint. Now, why is this? Well, you think about it. If you're somebody like Paul and you're writing to a Gentile church and you have to quote from the Old Testament, you have a choice. You can either use a Greek Bible, which they've already got, the Septuagint, or you could, knowing Hebrew, you could roll your own translation, and mentally make the translation from Hebrew to Greek yourself and write it again. So what do the New Testament writers do? They usually quote from the Septuagint. It just makes sense that they would do that, but not always. Occasionally, especially in Matthew, they quote from the Masoretic text, which is something to consider because, like I had mentioned earlier, some of the early church fathers said that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. So it's something to think about. Regardless, there's been a little bit of a cottage industry dispute which has come up lately, which has had some Christians taking like partisan sides, favoring the Hebrew Masoretic text and denigrating the Septuagint, or doing it the other way around, favoring the Septuagint and being highly critical of the Masoretic text. That is not something that Christians ought to do. We ought to hold a high view of both the Hebrew Old Testament, which is what Jesus and his disciples used and was primarily used by all the New Testament authors, and also the Septuagint, being the first Bible of the early church. We ought to have, I think, a high view of both as being scriptural and authoritative. So that is my short discussion of languages in the New Testament. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.